Now it is my distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Professor Marc Priewe. He is full professor and chair of American Studies at the University of Stuttgart. He previously worked as a visiting assistant professor of early American literature at St. Lawrence University, a part-time instructor at the New School, and a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard. His books include Writing Transit, Refiguring National Imaginaries and Chicano Narratives, Imagine Transnationalism, US Latino Literature, Culture and Identity, and Textualizing Illness, Medicine and Culture in New England, 1620 to 1730. His current research interests lie in transnational American studies, Latina studies, and digital humanities. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Priewe.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share my screen before I continue. Are you able to see the presentation, the PowerPoint slides? Saskia?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the German-American Center, and especially Kathrin Büttner and also Dr. Saskia Schabio for hosting and organizing this event and for inviting me to participate in it. I want to focus my 30 or so minutes comments on Urrea's short story on the following topics. I would like to talk a little bit about how my own university students might and will probably react to certain parts of the story. And I want to focus very quickly on the notion of perpetuating internalized racism and sexism. Then I want to point out some of the intertextual references in the story, namely to the novel The Stand and especially to trout fishing in America. That will then lead me to raise some ecocritical aspects of Urrea's story. And then I want to share some thoughts on lesson plans and material for teachers that I have had access to and that I was very happy to read. And actually, all of my points that I'm raising here come from having read the lesson plans and some of the material for the teachers, and they are thought of and they're intended as perhaps additions to the great points that have already been made in this material about how to usefully convey some of the points and information that Urrea is making to pupils in the EFL classroom. So as I've said, I would like to begin my presentation on Urrea's short story by what I think my university students would probably draw attention to. Now, I've not actually taught this story in class, yet I'm pretty sure that what I'm going to say will come up when we discuss the text in January of next year. I'm referring to the notion of internalized racism and sexism in the story, and especially the following passage. Quote, the Vatos didn't like the fucking wetbacks, that was for sure. Sureños from the south battled it out with Norteños from the north. Chicanos faced off against Mexicanos. Beaners versus rednecks. Everybody against the black brothers. And just forget about the Asians. It was natural selection, just as they had learned from Darwin, as explained by Professor Junior. Nobody liked nobody. Now, some of my students will probably not be happy with how the story depicts the ways in which the two main characters act in opposition to the myth of the melting pot by looking down on Mexicans and other racial and ethnic groups in the United States. What used to be called in the 80s and 90s the so-called rainbow coalition between different ethnic groups seems to have vanished altogether as there is seemingly no solidarity among disadvantaged groups in the United States. Instead, members of an oppressed group are shown to have internalized society's negative and racist portrayals of ethnic minorities and hence look down upon one's own group and other disadvantaged ones, instead of attempting to change the system or show ways of how to change the system. I'm quite often having this and similar discussions about realism versus idealism in literature in my classes. These discussions tend to center around the questions: should a literary text, especially one written by a member of a group that lacks privilege, depict reality as it is perceived, or shouldn't it rather show ways of how to overcome discrimination and to make social justice a reality, or both at least? Also, I wonder to what extent Junior and especially Shadow are depicted as likable character that would evoke sympathy or an empathy rather for social and cultural conditions of Chicanos and Chicanas in the United States, or to at least invite reflection of the reader's own search for identity. Adding to that, some of my students will probably point out the depiction of women in the story, who are referred to as, quote, two girlies in the backseat, La Smiley and La Lil Mousy. They were popping the gum, bored as always, filling the car with perfume, hair all ratted out. Throughout the narrative, they remain minor characters whose living conditions and views of the world are hardly explored, if at all. Furthermore, they appear as mere ornamental facilitators of the adolescent protagonist's passage into adulthood and masculinity, as we see later in the story. The two main male characters adopt rather than challenge stereotypical male behavior. This leads me to the question, which we might also talk about later on, to what extent this story then normalizes machismo. And doesn't Urrea's story perpetuate negative stereotypes of urban Chicanos rather than describing a more positive vision, even though that might be idealistic or utopian? So the second point of my presentation today on Urrea's short story concerns its intertextual references. That is, references to other literary texts that can expand, deepen, or amplify certain thematic or topical concerns of a given text. In the short story, there are two explicit intertextual references, both to novels written by male Anglo-American authors. And that's Stephen King's fantasy novel, The Stand, and Richard Brautigan's postmodernist novella, Trout Fishing in America. I'm actually not quite sure whether the reference to The Stand is actually to King's novel, but I was not able to find another possible author during a rather quick Google search. So please correct me if you know of another novel that is called The Stand, and then I would look that up. So the novel was published in 1978 and is a post-apocalyptic dark fantasy novel about America after a deadly pandemic, sort of like COVID, only worse, which less than 1% of the population survive, who are immune to the virus. The remaining human beings are depicted in the novel as incapable of avoiding previous civilizational mistakes. But I must admit that I have not had time to read this novel yet, so I cannot say anything more about thematic or stylistic similarities between Urrea and King. At the very least, though, this intertextual reference can be seen as a foreshadowing that the story isn't going to end well. And it shows also the protagonist's interest in non-Chicano cultural products and can hence be seen as a sign for his search for identity. I want to come back to the point that Professor Aldama made a few minutes ago about how Urrea is very, quote, very intentional about his writing. And I would argue and continue that point, he's intentional about choosing certain intertextual references and not others. It seems significant that Junior is reading this novel and later Trout Fishing in America and not, say, Bless Me Ultima by Rodolfo Anaya, one of the first Chicano novels published in 1972, or the aforementioned Oscar Zeta Acosta autobiography of a brown buffalo, or any other Chicano literary text that typically deals with how one is to find a viable path toward a solid sense of who one is. Instead, choosing Stephen King at this point of the short story seems to me to be yet another indicator of the story's larger theme of cultural hybridity and the ongoing search for an identity between being Vato or Gabacho for the adolescent protagonist, right? This is what Shadow tells Junior towards the end of the story. You got to choose to be either one. Even more telling with regard to the question of intertextual references, I believe, is the second and more pronounced reference to the novella Trout Fishing in America, which was also written by an Anglo-American author named Richard Breutigen, who lived from 1935 to 1984 and published his novel in 1967. The text is not a fishing guide, as the title might suggest, but rather one of the first American postmodern texts that was designed to appeal to a broader audience with its sort of idiosyncratic yet easy to read prose style. One of the interesting aspects about Breutigen's work is that he confronts various trash phenomena of postmodernism and does not so much look for a way out of the perceived degradation of American culture and environment at the time. During the early 1960s, Breutigen had met Allen Ginsberg and other members of the Beat Generation writers in San Francisco who had coined who were to coin the term counterculture, which was in essence a white middle-class rebellion against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights at home. Hence, Urrea's reference to trout fishing in America can be seen as yet another illustration of the cultural hybridity of the story's main character and his Chicano friend, Shadow, who is at one point depicted as looking like a hippie. But I think there's even more to gain from reading Breutigen and Urrea together. On a surface level, trout fishing in America seems to be about one of America's favorite pastime and traditional rite of passage for young or adolescent boys. Some of you may immediately think of Ernest Hemingway when hearing about fishing trips in American literature. And it comes as no surprise that Hemingway was Breutigen's most important writerly influence, especially with regard to the brevity of language use and many clues that are left for the reader to decipher. What makes Breutigen's novel a postmodern text, though, is its emphasis on the dissolution of meaning. Let me really quickly rehash some of the central ideas behind literary postmodernism without turning this into a graduate seminar on American literature. Very briefly. In postmodernism, so since the beginning of the atomic and space age in the 1950s, the idea of chaos is set against the existing aesthetic order of modernism. What mainly characterizes the concept and aesthetics of postmodernism is the decline of order, the dissolution of meaning, and the rejection of notions of truth or any stable notions of truth. Artistically, postmodernists often find it difficult to still be new. The arts, and especially literature, can no longer be innovative, so the theory goes. Reality has become so fantastic that the author can no longer imagine it in fiction, and hence one of the common mantras for describing postmodernism is that, quote, fact is fiction and fiction is fact. Some members of the postmodernist literary movement in the United States at the end of the 1960s were, for a time at least, engaged with the goals and demands of countercultural movements of that time. But peace and equal rights weren't the only central political issues at the time. Especially in the so-called hippie movement, there's a trend back to the green or natural ideal. Ideas of green revolution and reconnecting with nature on a societal level really take hold again in the second half of the 1960s. Breutigen is one of these authors, illustrating developments in American society that are seen as an outgrowth of the contradictions caused by what literary critic Leo Marx has famously called the machine in the garden. In his 1964 book, The Machine in the Garden, Technology and the Pastoral Idea in America, Leo Marx analyzes classic 19th century white male American literature in order to explore a founding myth and trope of the United States, namely the interruption of the pastoral scenery by technology in the course of industrialization in and westward expansion of the United States, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries. In Breutigen's novella Trout Fishing in America, the contradiction of the machine in the garden as a deep-rooted and central trope in American literature becomes clear again. A search for a way of life that constantly negotiates between progress and nature, between post-civilizational destruction and pre-civilizational innocence. Breutigen is postmodern in his use of polysemy, or the coexistence of many possible meanings for a word or a phrase. In the course of his novella Trout Fishing in America, the seemingly simple and telling title, Trout Fishing in America, is applied to so many contexts that the original meaning is lost. While it appears to be a guide on how to trout fish in America, it actually refers to many things that one usually does not associate with the title of the book. Let me give you just a really quick reading sample from Breutigen's novella. Quote, he wore a costume of trout fishing in America. He wore mountains on his elbows and blue jays on the collar of his shirt. Deep water flowed through the lilies that were entwined about the shoelaces. A bullfrog kept crocking in his watch pocket, and the air was filled with the sweet smell of ripe blackberry bushes. So the term trout fishing in America is used in Breutigen's texts for, among other things, a person, various material, the novel itself as it is being written, the narrator's inspirational muse, and as a symbol of the pastoral ideal being lost to commercialism, environmental degradation, and social decay. In short, trout fishing in America becomes a signifier for basically everything and nothing. This vast inflation of the meaning of the phrase trout fishing in America actually leads to its decomposition. And this decomposition of meaning is used by Breutigen to illustrate his critique of American culture that has seemingly become arbitrary, chaotic, narcissistic, and destructive. In other words, Breutigen uses the theme of trout fishing as a point of departure for his thinly veiled and often comical critique of mainstream American society and culture. Now, Urrea's intertextual reference to Bräutigam cannot only be found explicitly by naming the title of the novella, actually twice, because Junior is given a copy of the novel, but already has one, which is under his bed. So it's not only naming the title of the novel, but also implicitly in the similarities of writing style that relies on short declarative sentences, some of which are aimed to formulate social and political criticism. But which culture, society, or group is being criticized in Urrea? I wonder whether through the intertextual reference to trout fishing in America, we can also see Urrea's short story as a similar critique of mainstream American society and politics, especially relating to immigration and border policies, but also to environmental issues. Or is the text rather a critique of Chicana culture, which is described in the story as violent, criminal, sexist, and uneducated? It's probably both, but then how are each evaluated? Is the critique directed equally? I would be very interested in what other participants of this event think about this. I would claim, however, that Urrea also models his own critique of environmental degradation based on the cues from Bräutigam, as can be seen in the second section of the short story, when Junior and Shadow go on the canoe trip. Here, the ecocritical aspects of the story become evident, or particularly evident. The narrator references the current state of pollution and environmental destruction, and yet the references to the old slaughterhouse by the pond seems to hint at the past, the time of Native Americans, or possibly or rather European settlement, when human beings would clean dead animals at the shores of a pond. Seen this way, Urrea is pointing back to the machine in the garden that has been causing environmental pollution throughout the settlement of the land, especially by Europeans. Allow me to use Urrea's eco-criticism or use of eco-criticism as a segue to the final section of my presentation, where I want to very briefly raise some points in response to the teaching material that is available to me. First of all, let me say that I think that the material I was able to take a look at is great, very good, and will be very helpful to the EFL classroom as far as I can tell. I can only look at this from a literary and cultural studies perspective and not from a didactical. But important points that Urrea's text his text makes are being raised, especially with regard to identity and belonging. I also really like how the teaching material is really geared towards making the experiences of Junior and Shadow in the short story, two fictional Chicano characters, relatable to the lived experiences of, say, a 15-year-old pupil from Stuttgart or anywhere else in Germany or in the world, really, for that matter. But it's, of course, particular for students in Baden-Württemberg or in Stuttgart. In the teacher material, I came across a fantastic task for the pupils that I think might be useful to discuss in this context as well. Namely, what is the symbolic significance of Junior and Shadow paddling westward along the border? Very cleverly, the comments point out how this is a mock version of the original Lewis and Clark expedition, right, which was designed to strengthen the idea of American identity in the early 19th century. Quote, their trip questions, even destroys their idea of identity because it becomes clear that Shadow has the status of an illegal immigrant, right? Sort of mocking the idea of a positive and conclusive ending here. I do believe, however, that the eco-critical aspects of Urrea's short story could and should, in my opinion, be part of a teaching unit in this text. And if there is already other teaching material out there that does include that, I apologize. the material designed for teachers that I have had a chance to look at do not raise this aspect of the text, but I'm hoping that they will in the future. Now, my last point, perhaps, is this. Trout fishing in America, as I've indicated, I hope, draws attention to the title. And I want to draw attention to the title of the short story because I need some help with this if I want to continue my exploration of intertextual references. So, as the teaching guide says, the first part of the title, the Southside Raza, refers to part one of the story that takes place in the city, in the barrio. The core of discovery is, of course, a reference to the Lewis and Clark expedition, and it refers to the second part of the story where Shadow and Junior go sort of on this discovery of their own. But I wonder, what is an image federation? Can somebody tell me, please? I don't know. And what does it mean that this is sort of in between? Is this a way of negotiating the two? I really don't know. I'm at a loss. I hope that somebody can help me. But before I do that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk as well. Some really good questions raised, I think. I don't know if anyone wants to elaborate on that in the Q&A, like the questions you raised in your presentation, because I think it's really interesting to think about these. We do have a question here about teaching the story, and I think you kind of mentioned it a little in the end. So can the situation in the US be compared to the situation of immigrants in Germany or Europe? And is that something you would consider talking about in the classroom to make it more relatable, maybe?
Sorry, microphone was off. Sure, and that is very much part of also the teaching material I looked at. Yes, the obviously, as many of you know, we're having also discussions about, you know, future deportations and who's allowed to stay here, and you know, legal status versus social integration that has already happened. Right? We know a lot of stories about, you know, similar, like the character Shadow, who's fully integrated, but and identifies with very strongly, in this case, with the United States, but that does him no good, right? The state doesn't care about how he identifies, as Professor Aldama has greatly explained. But yes, absolutely, I think it's a very the story would be a very interesting way of opening up a comparative discussion about migration policies, but also especially sort of current deportation policies that are being developed. Right.
Kathrin, we can't hear you.
We do. I just realized I turned on my microphone. We do have another question here, but I think that might be maybe for Professor Aldama, and it's about a TV series and it's more about, you know, perception of Latinx experiences and things like that. So I don't know if I should just throw it in here.
Okay. I'm happy to share my time with Professor Aldama, so please go ahead.
So the question is, have you seen the TV series Jane the Virgin, and what do you think about using sequences of it in class? Maybe also, you know, in relation to Latinx culture or experiences. The show plays a lot with stereotypes, but also with the desires and struggles of a young Venezuelan girl, what she faces in Miami. Maybe if you've seen it, Professor Priewe, you
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have not.
I'll just really quickly, because I don't want to take more time away from our wonderful lecturer just now. Yes, teach it. It's great, but have bigger context in mind. Couple of things. remind the students that, in fact, while there is a voiceover narrator that is the Latin lover, very much inflected with the Latin lover, the stereotypical intonation and sounds and rhythms that we might associate with the male Latin lover voice, in the end, the story as it's conceived, we learn is in fact Jane writing the story. So the agency and the author is in fact a Latina. The other thing is, it could be interesting with the students to explore, I mentioned career author. Well, there's career actor that's interesting. So Gina Rodriguez and how that launched her and her career, but also Jenny Ortega, importantly, appearing as Wednesday. So I think you could have it as your center of gravity to explore how today in the 21st century, while we still face conditions of surveillance and racism, there are real leaps forward that have been happening, like Jane the Virgin. And because of all the hard lifting and heavy work of those who've come before and that continue to do the work to push doors open, not only to literary publishers, but also to writing room spaces where Latinos are now at least minimally invited to sit at the creative story thinking and story making table.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've seen the show as well, so that's really interesting for me too. So I have a question, and the next question here for Professor Priewe. How can one ensure that students understand the fact that Latinx people, and especially Latina women, are intentionally portrayed in a racist or sexist way?
Does that mean intentionally portrayed in a race by who?
I think, I don't know, maybe the person who
okay.
wrote the question can tell us that, but probably by Urrea.
Okay, if Urrea is meant here, then my answer would be, well, I think it's important to point out the blind spots, that this is the blind spots of perhaps a male author writing about women, Latino women in the barrio, right? And I think it's important to point out that this is not that the point of view of the Chicana characters is not further explored in the story. And what might one do is perhaps give students short fiction where that is addressed, right, as a sort of complement maybe to Urrea's short story. The only thing I can think of at the top of my head is a bit older, but it's still one of my favorite Chicana texts. Include a vignette from Sandro Cisneros' House on Mango Street to sort of give a perspective of female experiences in the barrio. Just as one example, but there are numerous others that one could add probably.
Can I just add something too? I think it would not be the same story. Okay, this gets to who is the ideal reader being constructed by the story? And it's really important to have our students understand and be educated and be critical of gender stereotyping. But it's also, I think, really important and critical for them to understand that this is actually a distillation and reconstruction of a very real family scene, and also a very real way that Latinas within our families and in our communities continue to be subordinate and continue to be seen in certain ways. So for our students to understand that, in fact, it enhances the kind of reconstruction of this, and the realism of it enhances the engagement precisely because of its sincerity, but at the same time, not to take this as the way that we should be acting. So two different things, right? So how is this story constructing a story world that is actually not just convincing, that is realistic, and at the same time equipping our students with the critical framing, as my colleague just mentioned, by providing other fictions told from the perspective of a young woman, for instance, and their journey and self-discovery, as a counterpoint. So not saying, Luis Urrea, we want you to have a enlightened protagonist in this situation because it's not as convincing if you don't, or that it's not doing the work that we want it to, but rather to equip our students with the critical framework that will allow them to kind of at once engage with the fictional reconstruction and the realism of that, and at the same time, and to evaluate on those terms, and at the same time to be more meta-critically alerted to how stereotypes function to restrict gender and gender movement within family and community.
Kathrin, actually, I would have another question for Professor Priewe, perhaps as a follow-up, if there are no further questions in the chat, but if there are.
Go ahead. I have another question, but I think you can go ahead and I'll take the other one later.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, isn't the absence of the mother really marked in this story? And we've been talking about the short story as also an aesthetic genre that builds on absences and invites gap-filling activities in readers. So I think there's just one reference really for our Big Angel's first New Year's without mums in the house. So I think that's quite interesting, a marked absence that then would yeah. What are your thoughts about it, Professor?
Yeah, great idea. Yeah, that you're raising attention to the absences in the short story. It's a very blind spot. It's very important. Yeah. One aspect of the short story that we haven't talked about yet, but I think that might also be relevant for teaching the story, is the whole gang culture, right? That this is so steeped in the language of gangs, the signs of gangs, and also gangs as sort of almost as a surrogate family, perhaps, as a different community. I'm sure our guests from the United States can say much more about that. Yeah, but I would second your thoughts that gap filling is part of Urrea's literary style, right? As I said, maybe borrowed from Hemingway and others, and through Breutigam as sort of also this where readers have to read certain signs, become a detective, and interpret cues in a certain way. And of course, the absence of certain cues is also something that we need to draw special attention to when we teach literature in general, and especially the short story, I believe. What is not said.
Thank you. I will, I don't know which one I will ask you first. I'll take this one. So we have a pretty simple question. So what time is the story set in? What do you think? Like past, present, or is it relevant? That's the
that's a great question. Thanks for raising that. I was so there's this is something I was wondering about myself. There's again cues that one needs to read, right? So at first the opening of the story that Professor Aldama read out earlier in his talk sets the setting in terms of space, but not so much in terms of time. Not immediately in sort of in your face, but there are, of course, a number of references or clues that one can read. For instance, the reference to music, Lady Gaga, and was it urban rap music or hip hop or something, and also the reference to President Reagan. See, I was hoping, or I was thinking for a time, well, maybe since there are these intertextual references, maybe the story is set in the 60s, and what difference would that make? But it's not, because that doesn't make much sense, because it has to come after Reagan, because Reagan is mentioned and it's been a long time. So, and then when you then consider, the time it was published and the sort of political events that were occurring at the time with the Dreamers Act and so forth, and immigration policy reform, if you want to call it that, under Obama, then I think it's fairly clearly set in the 2010s or in the beginning of the 21st century. But I find it still interesting to further explore maybe the many historical references that are being made in the story, and that show that the problems that are being raised here with regard to immigration, a racist society, environmental degradation, are not new things, but actually go back a while, right? I mentioned the reference to the slaughterhouse, which I think is set in the past because the sentence is introduced with the temporal marker back in the day, whenever that was. So apparently this is not something that is happening right now. Or the reference to the veteranos, right? The OGs, the original gangs, the old members of the Chicano gangs, which is indicated by the T-shirt that they're wearing, or the shirt or whatever that they're wearing. The reference to the lobos, the wolves, right, and the golden tooth, which then of course comes back later in the story when Junior has a tooth in his shoe, right? So so that would be my answer. It's not explicitly stated. I think it's implicitly clear, but again, I think it's the point is to again show that this is not necessarily a phenomenon of the past only that are being described, phenomena of the past that are being described, but this is something that has a history, has a precedent.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not really relevant probably because it can be set in, or could have happened in a lot of times, right? So one more question. I don't know if anyone can answer that. Are you familiar with the Nickelodeon series, The Casa Grandes? If so, would you teach that to younger students? And do you see it as a positive Latinx representation?
Sorry, I have to pass on that one again.
Me too.
I think that's another one that's really interesting in terms of context, reception, and its cancellation. Casa Grande was innovative in lots of ways. One, it brought in actual Latinos into the writing room, including a friend of mine, Lalo Alcaraz. It's satirical in the same way that we see with The Simpsons, satirical also involving the airing, say, of dirty laundry, our dirty laundry as a Latino community. And it was ultimately canceled. So again, going back to popular culture, yes, we've made advances. Yes, we're seeing more kind of out there, but it's also very quickly, even if it hits the right numbers, pulled from the airwaves. Casa Grande was innovative and remarkable in that it was basically taking the same worldview and sensibility of a Simpsons into the space of Latino life, family life. And I loved it for that very reason, which is to say that it didn't hold back to poke fun at and and at the same time invite us to laugh with, not Modern Family, which only ever invites us to laugh at Gloria, but to laugh with the kind of shenanigans, the internalized kind of weirdnesses that surface in our own family life.
Thank you. So I have, oh, here we go. Now I have two more questions. One is for Professor Aldama. Maybe we can do that in the roundtable discussion again. It's a more, general question. So would you consider Shadow as integrated in American society because he wanted to, or because he had to? Because he wanted to be integrated, or because he had to, in order to blend in because of the American dream and so on.
I don't know whether the question is for me or so. I can try and maybe okay.
Yeah.
I don't think the novel makes any reference as to whether he wants to or has to. The sense I get is he wants to. Although it's of course a little over the top, right? He's the USA all the way, and the way he insults the border patrol officer. But that leads me to another point that hasn't been raised so far, and I think that's really important. And it's actually a question I would have for Professor Aldama that I had written down when he was giving his wonderful presentation, and that's the role of humor and the comical in the story. I mean, it's this. I find this a very humorous, very funny, actually. I mean, in parts, funny and tragic, of course, but these often go together. And I just find Shadow one of these sort of comical characters in a way, in some instances at least. So I can't really answer that question from the evidence that I've seen from the text, whether he feels he has to or he wants to. Because actually he doesn't have to, I think. I don't think, the community, the Chicano community traditionally would push him towards identifying with the USA in such a way, because that's actually something that Chicano politics since the 1960s by and large rejected, right? That's why they would often identify as Chicanos and not Mexican Americans, because they did not identify as USA all the way, right? So he is a very multi-layered, quite an ambiguous character in that way, I think, and especially I'm especially also interested in the question of that he raises to Junior. Are you going to be a Vato or Gabacho, right? A member of the Chicano community, or basically a foreigner, which is a term for an American. Are you going to be Chicano or American? And maybe the story's sort of larger abstract ideas or question is whether that's a false dichotomy, or even a question, or even the necessary question to ask, or the tragedy, what happens, if you identify in a certain, as I said before, you identify in a certain way, but then the state doesn't care about how you identify, and is shown as sort of the superior power of surveillance and control and discipline and so forth. Professor Aldama has pointed out that that sort of against which sort of these questions really don't matter how you identify, right? Vato or Gabacho. So that was a long-winded answer. So maybe Professor Aldama wants to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, for story making effect, we Luis is very aware of the fact of the huge kind of twist and irony, and the declaration USA all the way, amplifies that. But it's also, as you were just mentioning, so there are certain identifiers within community and family of Vato Loco, Gabacho, a kind of sellout, or like, are you in, are you down? And then there is an identifier, in this case of, say, false confidence, as it encounters the agent of surveillance, so the migra. And so I think what the takeaway might be with students is that identities, not identity, and contexts, family, familial, community, nation, border, borderland, region, urban, rural, will surface or bring to the surface different identities. So that's how I would answer that. And again, going back to the point that, yes, we have Latinx or Latino as a pan identifier, but in actuality and practice, not just historical policy, etc., but within family, there's also huge amounts of differences. So for instance, we have, and Samantha, again, later in the roundtable, we can talk about this, but we have family, our own family, a sister, for instance, who votes very differently to me, who thinks of things very differently to me, for instance. And I can say that very much, right? So while we want to have the bigger identifier as a way to together kind of push against a mainstream that has been putting us in boxes, at the same time, it's important to have stories like this that remind us of that context, and where we are in those contexts, family, community, nation, region, will kind of determine what identities surface.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we actually do have a few more questions, but I think maybe we can answer them in the roundtable, and maybe someone else can also elaborate on them.